At the 20th annual Michael Jordan Flight School, this is pretty cool, Jordan held a Q&A where he answered questions from the campers. Some of the questions were best trash talker, all-time Bulls versus Lakers, Jordan versus LeBron in their primes, and if you had one game to play, who would you want as your coach?
If I had to play one game, who would I want to coach? Phil Jackson or Dean Smith? Dean Smith. Oh, wow. Unfortunately, Dean Smith helped me become the basketball player I am today. Phil was lucky because I was taught the game by Dean Smith.
Pretty cool moment for those campers. Skip, how surprised were you to hear this?
It sounded like a lot of people in the audience at the camp were surprised because I heard a lot of wows, oohs, and ahs. I was shocked, Stephen A. I guess it's possible that Michael was just paying his respects to a Dean Smith, the great Dean Smith, who obviously passed away just last February. But I was there in 1998 in Chicago covering that last Bulls run to the 6th championship, and Michael said all year long, if they replace Phil with that guy from Iowa State, that Tim Floyd guy, I'll quit. Michael quit. That's how much I thought he believed in and loved and had that soulmate connection with the coach who let Michael be Michael Jordan, and that was Phil Jackson. So I try to keep it in the perspective of, I always used to hear that the only man who could stop Michael Jordan when he was in college was Dean Smith, because occasionally the system, the Dean Smith system, stifled Michael, especially in his sophomore, junior years. And as you recall, he fell all the way to 3 in that draft. So there were people out there who thought, oh, he's not so great. But yet he's saying now that Phil was lucky, which I found to be a harsh description of what Michael had learned from Dean Smith, that Phil was lucky I learned to play basketball under Dean Smith, that Phil benefited greatly. And I don't doubt that. It just seemed like sort of a harsh sort of perspective to put it in for those campers. Maybe he was just completely off the top of his head, but I thought he would have paid Phil a little more respect than he did.
The fact of the matter is, Skip Bayless, he didn't pay Phil Jackson the respect because Phil Jackson didn't deserve it. And I know a lot of people will find that incredulous on my part to say, thinking that it's some residue from the atrocious job he's done thus far as the executive of the New York Knicks.
I suspect that a little bit.
But I swear to you, that's not it. I know how great of a coach Phil Jackson was. I know that Phil Jackson deserves an abundance of credit for managing superstars. You know, the Michael Jordans with the Scottie Pippens, with the Dennis Rodmans, the Shaquille O'Neals with the Kobe Bryants, the Ron Harpers, Robert Horrys, those kind of teams. But when you ask Michael Jordan that direct question, what Michael Jordan and anybody in Michael Jordan's position should inhale is that, how did I get to the point that I was at for Phil Jackson to take me to another level? That's who you owe the most gratitude to. It's not the people who polished you. It's the people who made you, who created you, who helped formulate you into who you ultimately became. And there is no question that that was Dean Smith. Phil Jackson might have come to Michael Jordan and say, this is who you are. But in order for you to accomplish your goals, you're going to have to do this. So he didn't help Michael Jordan create something. Anything that Michael Jordan ultimately materialized into was already in him. Phil Jackson just polished it and allowed it to elevate and shine. In the case of Dean Smith, he taught Michael Jordan how to play basketball. And that's what Michael Jordan said. And if that man taught you how to play basketball, you know, that's who you give homage to and pay the most credit to. Now, obviously, since Dean Smith just passed away, you know, last year, I mean, we understand that that may have had something to do with the level of deference that Michael Jordan elected to show to him over Phil as well. But to me, it's a no-brainer. The people who teach you and help you become who you are is who deserves the most credit. It's not to say that Phil Jackson doesn't deserve a lot of credit. It's to say that the credit that he deserves pales in comparison to Dean Smith. Now, nobody else would Michael Jordan say that about over Phil. But you've got to say it about Dean Smith over Phil. You just have no choice.
Remember, the question was one game. Let's just do it like sort of one game for your life. Would you want Phil or Dean Smith? And he went Dean Smith because Dean Smith taught him how to play basketball. Wow.
Exactly.
So you won 6 championships with this man at the helm, Phil Jackson.
Because I don't think you understand it. Michael Jordan essentially is saying that Dean Smith is responsible for Phil Jackson helping him get 6 rings. That's what he's saying. Dean Smith is responsible for Phil Jackson helping him get the 6 rings. Without Dean Smith, Phil Jackson wouldn't have had Michael Jordan to help because Michael Jordan would not have been Michael Jordan. That's what Michael Jordan is saying. I can understand that.
And it's hard for me to think that Michael paid much respect to Phil because you're basically saying he took Phil to another level once he got to pro basketball.
Well, that is true because, I mean, listen, it's vice versa. I mean, look. Has Phil ever won anything without Shaq, Kobe, or MJ and Pippen?
No.
Never happened.
Okay, but he was their coach all the way through their championship run, so something.
I'm not taking anything away from him. I know Phil Jackson's a great coach, but he had great talent. And I'm telling you that the person who helped manufacture and develop the talent is the one that deserves the most credit because they're the ones that gave you something to work with to begin with. That's what matters.
Okay. Well, I liked what he said. I was just surprised by it.
Yeah. So not a shot at Phil Jackson.
Because it was the truth.
Just giving Dean Smith the credit for helping to develop him. Both of them, 2 of the best, Phil Jackson and Dean Smith. Is Terrell Owens one of the best, though? He's eligible to become a first ballot Hall of Famer. Does he deserve that? We'll discuss coming up. The National Football League lost a legend Sunday. Pro Football Hall of Famer Frank Gifford passed away in his Connecticut home at the age of 84. A versatile star both on defense and offense, making Pro Bowls at 3 different positions: running back, wide receiver, and defensive back, in an era when NFL players were starting to specialize. Gifford went on to a successful second career as a broadcaster, joining Monday Night Football. He was the NFL's most valuable player in 1956 when he led the Giants to a league championship. His family released the following statement: "We rejoice in the extraordinary life he was privileged to live, and we feel grateful and blessed to have been loved by such an amazing human being." Skip, how will you remember Frank Gifford?
Molly, you used the word iconic a few minutes ago as you were leading into this segment. And Stephen A., this man was iconic, and I don't use that word very often. This man, Frank Gifford, was the definition of a legend to me. A sports legend, a broadcasting legend, golden boy, running back, tailback, as they called him in those days at USC. Then on to the New York Football Giants, where he was an MVP and obviously a champion. And then on to the Monday Night Football booth, where he was the ever dependable glue that kept that show together through that all-time great run of Howard Cosell, Dandy Don Meredith, as Frank Gifford was able on a nightly basis to referee those two, to keep them barely in bounds and the broadcast on schedule. He was masterful at it. I was always shocked because I crossed his path, Frank's path, a lot in press boxes, how nice he was to me, and I was just some newspaper guy from early on Los Angeles or from Dallas. He went out of his way to be nice to everybody in the press box, even though he came across, when you were in his presence, like he was royalty, like he was an ambassador, like he was some kind of NFL statesman. He just had that regal bearing about him. He did the league proud for years and years as a spokesman for the National Football League, and in the end, he will be missed because his presence will be missed in the National Football League.
Well, Skip Bayless, what I'm going to say is this. I'm going to do this man justice and pay homage to him by saying as few words as I possibly can and leaving that up to you, simply because when he was playing the game of football, I was not even born yet. And when he was broadcasting, calling 588 consecutive NFL games, you know, him with Don Meredith and Howard Cosell, it's the reason why I not only grew up loving football, but I grew up loving sports. The three of them together were absolutely phenomenal. I had the pleasure of meeting Frank Gifford one time in the 90s. He was a gentleman, you know, on an extraordinary level. He was just a kind, decent person. When you met him, he lived up to the reputation because everyone who had spoken of him had said that exact same thing. And obviously in the world of broadcasting, he's an iconic figure, and he was the straight man. You had Meredith and you had Cosell, and you know that anything could go any way with those two in the booth together. But Frank Gifford was the one that held a lot of it together and you know, steered the ship in a very, very steady direction. You know, when I look at the Mike Greenbergs of the world, who I consider an extraordinary traffic cop in our industry, I think he's the best in the business, to be quite honest with you. I think about somebody like Frank Gifford, who was somebody that he obviously idolized. So when you see pioneers like this, like Frank Gifford, such an iconic figure, such a gentleman, such a good man by so many accounts from the profession itself, all you could do is step back and say, thank God you had an opportunity to watch him work and watch him live his life the way that he did as a professional broadcaster, because he set an example for all of us to aspire to follow. He will be missed, obviously, but he will not be forgotten. He was an extraordinary individual, and my heart goes out, obviously, to Kathy Lee and the rest of their family.
Last quick point. I've read stories over the last 24 hours that say Frank Gifford through the 50s, through his time as a superstar with the Giants, was on par with a Frank Sinatra or a Mickey Mantle around New York City. I'm not sure I could go quite that far, but what amazed me about those comparisons was that Frank Gifford was in the conversation with Frank Sinatra and Mickey Mantle. And again, Mickey Mantle's my favorite all-time player.
Shared the locker with him.
Yeah. What's that?
He shared a locker with them, if I remember correctly, right? Did he share a locker with them at one time? They said
because they shared the stadium. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. They shared the stadium. Yes.
Yeah. I got you. But again, for Frank Gifford to get on that level at Toots Shor's, you know, the most famous bar at the time in New York City, restaurant bar, it's just inconceivable to me that he could achieve that. So that said it all for me about Frank Gifford. Wow.
It doesn't get much bigger than that in terms of transcending in mainstream. You talked about reading a few stories. One thing that spoke volumes to me, Skip and Stephen A., was the story of Vince Lombardi as an assistant of the New York Giants. Wasn't really connecting with the players, was a college coach, more of a taskmaster, and he reached out to Frank Gifford to be that bridge to the players. And if he won over Frank Gifford, he won over the entire team. So he truly was that a New York Giant as well. So I found that very interesting and impressive for his respect there. So he will be missed, and thank you guys both for honoring him so eloquently right there. Frank Gifford passes away at the age of 84.